Mondays with the Mako. We are back with you guys to wrap up Group 2. Very excited to have Alan with us today. I actually get to call him Uncle Alan because of my relationship with Erica. She is very fond of Alan. Alan is technically Erica's godfather, but because of the strong relationship and Alan's inspiration and guidance, he's really known as Uncle Alan. So, Alan, thank you for your time today and spending your Mondays with the Mako and talking about your awesome background and your books.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. Well, let's get right into it because there's a lot on my docket here, and I want to give this about 15 or 20 minutes today and get you on with your afternoon. So you went to UCLA and studied political science with a vision to probably go into law with that, but found writing. How did you do that, Alan? How did you find writing and really dig into your passion with writing? Where did that come from?
Well, I'd always been a facile writer when I was in high school. I never gave any thought to actually being a writer professionally. My senior year at UCLA, I discovered the film department, and in addition to taking a lot of film history courses, I took a couple of writing courses. I did well in them, well enough to think that I might go to UCLA graduate school and see if I could get into UCLA graduate film school. In the screenwriting program, I'd try that for a year and a half, and then after that, if things didn't work any further with writing, I could go to law school, which I had also been admitted to. And as it turned out, that wasn't necessary, and everything worked out just great and much better than I or my parents or anybody else could have expected.
Awesome. So Star Wars, you were the ghostwriter for the original book. George contacted you and said, Alan, here's the manuscript of the movie. Can you dig into this and add some depth and write the book? Tell us how that happened.
My publisher was contacted. I had already done a number of movie novelizations and television novelizations for them, Random House Del Rey. And because of that, it was suggested when Del Rey bought the book rights to do Star Wars books, at the time there was no such thing, of course, it was suggested that I might be the right person since I had already done a bunch of novelizations for Del Rey, most notably the Star Trek logs, that I take a shot at it. And I said, sure. I was asked to go be vetted, more or less, by Lucas's lawyer, a gentleman named Tom Pollock, who later became CEO of Universal Studios. And upon passing that little interview, I then went out to Industrial Light and Magic, which at that time was in a rented warehouse on Kester Street in Van Nuys, 5 minutes from where I grew up. So I knew exactly where it was. And I met with George and John Dykstra and a bunch of other people working on the film, and everything went fine. And then I went home to write the book. That was 40 years ago, of course.
What did you think when you started writing the book? Like, what were your thoughts? I mean, you had done some other work before, like you had mentioned with Star Trek. How did you compare the two, or what were you thinking as you got into the material?
Well, I never thought, once I got a little ways into the screenplay, that they would ever get half of what was in the screenplay properly up on screen. It was too expensive. It had never been done before. But I did think to myself that if they could do that, then they just might have something really special. I thought it would be successful for sure if they could do that. You can predict success. You can't always predict special.
Nice. Well, let's talk about a few of your other books. I want to come back to Star Wars in just a second, but you've done some amazing things with Star Trek, the Alien series, Chronicles of Riddick, Transformers more recently, Clash of the Titans a bit ago, The Last Starfighter, which I really, really like the movie, and I haven't read your book, but I want to. And then Starman. I mean, Starman hit home in a way because of what was filmed in the crater, I think, in northern Arizona. Tell me a little bit more about maybe some inspiration that you've drawn from those books into, I guess, more of your standalone novels.
Well,
go for it.
I keep them separate. A novelization is a collaboration with the original screenwriters. And my job is to expand upon that without distorting it and to respect the work of the original writers. It's just as if I was writing an original novel collaborating with another writer. My original work is completely separate from the novelizations. And I do draw, you mentioned Meteor Crater, which figures prominently in Starman. That's where they obviously drew some inspiration for that scene, because it's a real place and a real location. When I go traveling, which I used to do a great deal of, I would just not really work when I was traveling, but I would act kind of like a sponge, and I would try to soak up as much of my surroundings, the culture, the geology, the geography, the languages, the environment particularly, everything I could, and then it would just kind of sit there, and when I was writing a book on a particular subject, I'd try to pull this and that from what I had seen and experienced, put it in the book. Once in a while, I would get an entire book out of a trip. For example, my wife and I, Joanne and I, spent 5 weeks driving around Tanzania with some friends back in 1983. And that was not such an easy thing to do. And I had a pretty good idea for a book before we left. But because of what I saw and what we experienced and the people we met, I threw out the whole outline I had put on hold in my head when I got home and wrote a completely different book, which was called Into the Out Of.
Awesome. A lot of what we talk about when we get together is your travel and what comes from that. Tell me a little bit more about that. When you go out on a travel expedition, do you go out with an agenda maybe for the book or the material that you're looking for so you can be a sponge? Do you know what you're looking for before you go, or you just kind of get there and open up?
When I first started traveling, that's what I did. I'd go with a preconceived idea, with the idea kind of like you've got the blank canvas and this is how you're going to fill it in. But specifically because of what happened in 1983, I realized that it was much better just to throw everything out and go with a completely open mind and nothing planned ahead of time, and just let things hit me as I went. I mean, you've done some traveling yourself, and you can't help but go with a preconceived idea of what you're going to see. But invariably, what you see and what you encounter is completely different from what you expect.
Awesome, Alan. Well, tell me a little bit about, let's talk about Transformers more recently, because that's been a really fun movie series for Erica and I. And I know that was fun for you getting into that with some of the recent technology and all of that awesomeness in those movies. Tell us a little bit about writing for Hollywood, and more specifically the Transformer series.
Well, I was not a big fan of Transformers when I was given the assignment to first rewrite an original novel that was a lead-in to the first film, and then to do the novelizations of films 1 and 2, plus a bridging novel called The Veiled Threat, which actually fits between films 1 and 2. But as I got into it, what I found myself attracted to was not the humans who are featured in a lot of the ads for the films, but the Transformers themselves. And the more fans, old-time, long-time fans of Transformers that I talked to would be perfectly happy to have a film with no people in it whatsoever. I mean, they're interested in the Transformers and in the characters of the Transformers and their own internal politics and conflicts. And that's what really made it enjoyable for me to write those books, was being able to get inside the heads of giant alien robots. The fact that one of the characters happened to be a kid living in Southern California. I knew lots of kids living in Southern California. Most of them aren't very interesting. But giant alien robots, that you got me there.
Very cool, Alan. Very cool. Chronicles of Riddick. Interesting book. I actually, I'm going to start reading some of your stuff. I think it's time to do that, but I've got a pile of books here that I can't even finish. So I don't want those to stack up to those, and that pile just to be massive. But Chronicles of Riddick, how did that one stack up in all of the books that you've written? I know you've talked about that one a few times. I've heard you and Erica talk about the Chronicles of Riddick. She really likes that.
Well, there are a number of differences with a lot of the other films that I've novelized. For one thing, it's a much more adult story than, say, Transformers or Star Wars. It's a very downbeat story, actually. Your main protagonist, your hero or anti-hero, whichever you prefer, is a murderer and a renegade. And then in the Chronicles of Riddick, not in Pitch Black, which was its predecessor, or in Riddick, which was its successor, but in Chronicles of Riddick, the bad guys are such bad guys that they actually worship death. And There's a lot of mass destruction and killing going on, and it's a very, very downbeat sort of a storyline. And it becomes very difficult to find a place to, as a writer, hook onto, where you have somebody that the reader in this case, because we're talking about the book, can actually identify with in a positive manner. And there are two scenes in that movie, which of course are also in the book, that basically, as far as I'm concerned, rescue the character. There's one scene for those people who've seen the movie but haven't read the book, as I say, it's in both, where in the last part of the film, they're on a planet that rotates, and when it faces the sun, the temperature goes up hundreds of degrees, where Riddick rescues a girl. That's one scene. But to me, the critical scene in the whole film, the whole story, when the bad guys, they're called necromongers, the death worshippers, are attacking this planet that Riddick happens to be on, and he's running through a city that's under assault and attempts to save himself, because that's what he does, is preserve himself. There's a little girl who's by herself, and he hesitates, and then he saves her. He gets her out of the line of fire, basically. And what's critical about that scene to me and to the character is not that he saves her, because we expect he's going to do that. It's that he hesitates before doing it. And that means he's thinking about, am I going to do this or not? And that really gives you an insight into the character. And you look for that as a writer. You look for those little insights into the true nature of a character. And from that, you can build a great deal of other characterization on that. So that one scene was critical for me for the development of the character, and throughout that, through the whole book. Also, Erica and Joanne, my wife, are both huge fans of Vin Diesel, as every member of the opposite gender seems to be. But I can report from personal contact that Vin's a very nice guy. So,
you're no reason there, Alan. I've heard that too, by the way. That's awesome.
Sure
that's funny too. I really like that. Your insights into the true nature of the character, so I could go and add more on that characterization. Quickly, I want to ask you, of your novelizations that you've done, which one is your favorite and why? You've done quite a bit there.
Well, it's really hard to pick one. It's usually better to ask an artist, which is their favorite painting or their favorite composition or their favorite book or favorite short story. I do have a soft spot in my heart for Alien, because it's all atmosphere, really. There's a lot less action in the novelization of Alien, as there is in the film, than a lot of the other films I've novelized. And as a writer, that allowed me to do certain things that I just didn't have time to do in certain other novelizations. Also, it was written in 3 weeks. I was on a very tight schedule. So that's a particular early favorite.
Very cool. Very cool. Right now, if you were going to grab a book and an author maybe that you enjoyed it to follow or to read, who is that? Who do you like to read, or if you do?
Science fiction or non-science fiction?
Well, let's say science fiction, sticking with this genre.
There are 3 writers, old-time writers I particularly like. Eric Frank Russell, who was a British writer, hysterically funny and also insightful. Murray Leinster, who was the best pure storyteller I ever encountered in the field. And Robert Sheckley, who I think was the best writer of science fiction short stories there ever was. So there's 3.
Excellent, Alan. Excellent. Well, let's jump into The Force Awakens a bit, because that's just hot. It's fresh. It's all over the place still. And I mean, what is it, three months out still? So great job with being a part of that. I'm going to get the book and read that, just because it's something that Eric and I said we were going to do, and we want to do that and contribute to that for you. How did that go? That was a hard book to write, I can imagine, because of all of the futuristic things that you've got to map out and be cognizant of in writing this. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it was interesting, of course, going back to Star Wars after so many years, although I had written a bridge book, an original spin-off novel called The Approaching Storm, which was a bridge between episodes 1 and 2. But it had been a lot of years. The thing now is that since it's an ongoing franchise and a very valuable franchise for Disney now, there's a lot more control over the Star Wars storyline and timeline than there was in the beginning, when it was just one film that hopefully would make a couple of dollars. And what they want is, they've rebooted Star Wars canon. So all of the previous Star Wars spin-offs and all of the previous comics and Star Wars novels, except for those that they have marked as canon, are now considered Star Wars legacy, which means they're nice stories, but they don't really relate to the rebooted Star Wars timeline. And since they've rebooted that timeline, they now have a group called the Lucasfilm Story Group, one of whose jobs is to supervise that timeline and make sure that everything that comes out from now on, not just the films, but the books, the comics, everything else, all relates to each other. So that if you pick up, say, a Marvel comic 5 years down the line, it's not going to contradict something that shows up in, say, Episode 7. So when I was writing the novelization of The Force Awakens, every word had to be reviewed to make sure that it would fit into canon, the new canon. For example, one of the things that they're very concerned about is, if I put something in the official novelization of the movie, then it becomes canon. So if I say that one character has blue eyes and there's some story reason that they're talking about, maybe for Episode 11, where the character, for story reasons, has to have brown eyes, I have to change that character's eye color to brown in The Force Awakens so that 15 years down the line, when they get to that point in the timeline, the character's eye color will line up. So it's a lot more work in that respect. I still had a certain amount of freedom, there's no question about that. But it's much tighter control than it used to be.
Yeah. How much more work was it? I mean, if you were to say, Jared, it was another week and a half, it was another 18 hours. I mean, how much more, Alan?
How much more work?
Yeah, how much more work in that book because of those tweaks and those edit pieces?
It wasn't that much more actual work in the standpoint of that much more actual writing. It was more a question of me making suggestions in the story, not saying, chapter 4, episode 3, suggestion 6, but actually writing something in and then having to have it vetted by the story group and having them say, this is okay, or this has to come out. So it wasn't a lot of work in the sense of a lot more writing, but it's just a lot more back and forth.
More communication, right? More process. Okay, I understand that. How did you like the movie? Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the movie. We've talked a little bit about it, but it was early before we could talk in kind of some depth around the book too.
Well, I thought the movie was great. It had lots of fun. It harkens back to the spirit of the first 3 films. And that basically was what fans who've been following the series for so many years really wanted. It was just, the expectations were so low. It was essentially from the fans like, please just make a movie that doesn't suck. And Abrams and Kasdan and Arndt and everybody else who was involved with the creation of the film did a lot better than making a movie that just didn't suck. They made a really good movie.
Yeah.
People will quibble about everything. And Star Wars fans, and Star Trek fans, and Alien fans who are inveterate followers of the franchises will nitpick everything from which way a belt buckle is facing to whether or not a character is allergic to a certain flower. And that's just half the fun of following a series like that closely. It's a harmless diversion, to say the least.
Right. From some differences in the book to the movie, we've talked a little bit about the ending. Tell us quickly a little bit about the ending in the book versus the ending in the movie without really spoiling anything here. I mean, we're not doing that anymore because of the time lapse here, but no spoiler alert, people.
The ending in the book is the same as the ending in the movie. That's not changed at all. But there are a couple of things that I can tell you about, a couple of things I was allowed to change that are in the book. I can't obviously tell you about things that I changed that are not in the book and then not in the film either.
Sure.
But for instance, and just to show you that this sort of back and forth works both ways, before the book was finished, there was apparently enough discussion within the story group and other people as to what happens to, I'm talking to people now who've seen the film, obviously, what happens to the character of Poe Dameron, the X-Wing fighter pilot, between the time he crash lands on the planet Jakku and suddenly shows up in the movie at the Rebel base and says, "Hi, Finn." Like, how did he get off Jakku? How did he survive? What happened to him? It was the story group that actually said, could you write that sequence for the book? So I I created that sequence in the book. And some people write and assume that it's a sequence that was filmed but was cut from the final edit. But it was never filmed at all. It was just something the story group asked me to put in the book. As another example going the other way, I'm very big on science. And even though it's Hollywood science, and there's a lot of what's called hand wavium, which is Hollywood science, I thought I could improve a little bit on the actual physics of the Star Killer-based weapon. And I went and researched real astrophysics and physics and came up with something that's at least more plausible, let's say, than what you said.
Destroy the sun, Alan.
And they left it in. It's in the book. What's really funny about that is the physics are so esoteric that I had to use that there are people who write and comment and say, well, you just made all this stuff up. It doesn't make any difference anyway. But it's actually taken from real physics. It's just that some of the terms involved, like Elysium and quintessence and phantom energy, sound like made-up terms, but they're not. They're real physics. So
awesome, Alan.
It goes around and around this way.
Really good depth. That's incredible. I'm looking forward to reading that book with Erica. Really good stuff. Well, tell us what you're working on right now, or what's in the future for you. What you've got on the docket, or what are you looking forward to?
Well, I had an original, an epic fantasy that takes place entirely underwater, come out from Wordfire Press a week before the ebook version of Force Awakens came out. So that's out. I had a book come out. What's today? The 6th. I had a book come out on the 2nd, 4 days ago, from Open Road Media called The Deavies, Deavys, from Open Road Media, which is a young adult fantasy set in Pennsylvania and Manhattan. And I'm currently working on a nonfiction book called The Director Should Have Shot You, which is the history of my involvement with novelizations.
Oh, wow. That's going to be awesome. When's that thing due?
Well, I have to finish the book first, and then we have to find a publisher, and that's how it goes. So I have no, obviously, publisher release date for that. But it's a lot of the questions like the ones you just asked. People do ask them in different interviews and over the years, and it finally occurred to me, there's a lot of history involved there. If you live long enough, you become history. And maybe I should get them down on paper so that when I'm no longer available to be interviewed, people can at least read the book and find out the answer to them.
That's incredible. I look forward to that. Well, I've got one more question for you. Let me throw my shades on here. That's how I end my interviews, Alan. It's time to go, my friend. But what advice would you have for an up-and-coming writer, maybe somebody that's picking it up as a hobby, somebody that likes to read nonfiction or sci-fi or fiction books and wants to start writing? What would you say?
Read a great deal of what you want to write. There's nothing more frustrating than spending a year on a book and sending it into, say, if it's science fiction, analog magazine, and having the editor write you back and say, this is really well written, but Ross Rocklin did the same thing in Astounding in 1936. So you have to have a background in what you're going to write, whether it's westerns or mysteries or contemporary, anything else, to make sure you don't copy something that's already done. Second, after you write what you like, write what you like, whatever you like to read, and always write something every day. Whatever you're doing, if you do a little bit of it every day, whether it's riding a bike or conducting interviews or doing anything else, if you do a little bit of it every day, you're going to get good at it. If you write 1 page a day, even if it's not very good, for a whole year, at the end of that year, you'll have a book. It may not be a great book, but you can always go back and revise it. But you will have a book.
Well, I see you've got your guy here. I've got my little guy with you. Smokey, say hi to Uncle Alan. Who do you got there, Alan?
This is Stubbs. Stubbs a little old to be picking up, I'm afraid, but you got the wrong end. Say hi, Stubbs. Okay.
Say hi, Mo. Thanks, Alan.
Stubbs is 16.
Here. I enjoyed the hangout. Thanks for spending your Mondays with the Mako, Alan, and for being Uncle Alan. It means a lot to me, and I enjoy our friendship. It's 15 plus years now, and I enjoy getting this content to the community. I'll put a bunch of your material into the post on Monday. And I'll certainly let you know when that's available. And I've got some Bronco gear back there, Alan. I know you've said that Carolina should just take this thing, but give me a little bit of your luck on this, and let's go Orange Crush. And
Yeah, I saw the orange shirt.
Yeah, Erica's got a nice Elway jersey. We'll wear that tomorrow, and we'll root for the Broncos. But bless you, Alan. Thank you. Say hi to Joanne. We love you guys. And keep it up, man. You're amazing.
See you around.
All right, cheers.